Good morning, everyone. This is Jennifer Clark. I'm the Operations Coordinator with the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I'd like to take a moment to welcome all of you for today's webinar. While I'm going through some logistics for today, if you wouldn't mind, you can introduce yourselves in the chat box. So I'm going to hand it over to Connie Neal after logistics. So just a few housekeeping items to get us started. All phone lines are going to be muted. So we do ask that you enter any questions or comments in the chat box today. You do have a choice of audience. If you would like for one of us to read a question or comment out anonymously, we can do that by selecting all panelists in the two line above the chat box. Or if you are comfortable sharing questions or comments in general, you can post it to all attendees, and that will also allow us to read out your name when we say it out. It is going to be anything posted in the chat box. We are going to repeat for accessibility for any folks that might join us on the phone today. We are recording today's session, and a copy of the recording will be sent in a follow-up email along with a copy of the slides and contact information for Diane Leonard, our presenter today. And with that, I will hand it over to Connie Neal for the introduction. Connie?
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. I'm really glad that you're able to join us. And I think if you are like me, when you saw some of the introductory comments about what this webinar is about, it's like, yes, of course, nonprofits, we're all being asked to do things, oftentimes in situations where it feels like there's less and less available for us to do the work that we're being asked to do. And the amount of change that's happening in our world, it just feels like it's speeding up, and there are a lot of big issues going on all around us, certainly with the pandemic, with other issues that are taking place in our country and our world. This is really a big period of change, and it really impacts our work in so many different ways. And sometimes it feels really tough to figure out, what are our next steps? How do we move forward with our work? But we do have some ideas here, and that's why I'm so glad that Diane Leonard is joining us today. She will be talking through a framework for us to think about and how we can do our work, and laying out some ideas and thoughts about Agile principles that will just help us feel maybe a little bit more grounded, and really looking at ways that we can get to that goal of having twice the impact of our work, and knowing that there are so many ways that the evolution is going to continue to happen into the future. But if we have that kind of good solid foundation and principles to work from, I think it's going to make the work easier for us and much easier for the people and survivors that we serve. So just a couple of quick notes about Diane. She is a certified grant professional and approved trainer with the Grants Professional Association. She's also a Scrum trainer, a Scrum master, and Scrum product owner through Scrum Inc. And you'll hear a little bit more about Scrum in a few minutes. And one of the things that I really like about Diane's experience is she started out doing work as a program officer, kind of on the side of reading grants and proposals, and currently still serves as reviewer for grant making organizations. But she also does a significant amount of work with nonprofits around proposal development itself. And you'll see in the bio materials that were attached to the registration that she and her team were successful in acquiring over $76 million in grants. And so I think with the perspective that she and her team brings around nonprofit work, around grants, around projects, around Scrum and Agile techniques, I think it's going to be a great discussion today. And I'm really looking forward to diving into this process with Diane. And just one other note too, when Diane's not thinking about Scrum and Agile and grants, she is in the Thousand Islands region of New York State, and she might be out for a run or a good cup of coffee. So without further ado, I want to introduce Diane Leonard. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks, Connie. And you're right, the Thousand Islands and running and coffee. And the good news is that both of those things have happened today. So I'm fired up and ready to talk about Scrum and Agile. And, Connie did a great job sharing my bio in a nice narrative friendly format. Here it is, the formal version. What does it really mean? I have spent my entire career in nonprofits. That's what it means. And so my first love was grants. And it was about being a grant maker and then helping organizations think about how to make grants less stressful and manage their organizational capacity in a way that improved their grant readiness and their competitiveness. The reality is that organizational behavior type work, the organizational strategy work, it ties perfectly with our work in Scrum and Agile. And so my second love, it's Agile and Scrum, which is why I am so excited to talk with all of you today to help you, regardless of your role in your nonprofit and the way you support nonprofits, to help you think about what Scrum is. It's a uniform approach to work, so I want to help you understand what that framework looks like at a very high level, and to help you think about what it means to be agile. How can you bring that to your own teams, to your own work? So we've got the chat box. I'd love to entertain questions at any time during today's conversation. I've got an agenda up on the screen for you now. We'll walk through some of the basics. What is Scrum? Why do nonprofits use Scrum? We'll talk about agile leadership, and then I'm going to share some case studies with you so that you can get some ideas, find some inspiration from nonprofits that have been using the Scrum framework or other agile principles in their work. So at any point, please, feel free, throw questions in that chat box. You do not need to parking lot them till the end, but we will absolutely cover them at the end as well. So that's our plan for our time together today. And what is Scrum? What is it? If you don't mind, in the chat box, if you knew or had some dangerous knowledge about Scrum or Agile before you came to today's webinar, go ahead and give me a Y for yes, or if not, give me an N for no. I would love to get a sense of where people are starting from. Is this a completely new topic, or had you heard of it before? So as you're doing that, I've got up a slide. To me, Scrum, a lot of people think about it as Post-its, and that's true. It's about making our work visible, and I'm going to explain more about that as we go along. It looks like for most of you, this is a new concept, a new topic. So let's make sure that we've got some good base understanding together. I just used the word Scrum and Agile when I asked you about any knowledge, any dangerously knowledgeable ideas you might have. So let me start by helping you think about it this way. When we talk about Agile, that is a really big umbrella under which numerous frameworks exist. And Scrum is one of those frameworks. So you can see Scrum listed under that red umbrella on the upper left-hand side. And the reason I'm going to share mostly about Scrum today under this umbrella is that the other frameworks, while all agile in their nature, they are more towards software development, lean, more towards manufacturing. Scrum is a framework that transcends across different types of work, and we have great case studies that show how it works in nonprofits, in churches, in arts organizations, in small grassroots organizations, in big urban community centers. We've got lots of great examples showing how that framework works in nonprofits. So that's why we're going to spend our time in that framework today. But I want you to understand that umbrella. What is Agile? I mean Agile with a capital A, not lowercase a. And so Agile is a term that really has been around in the field of work, the field of teams, mostly in the for-profit and software space for decades. And the Agile Manifesto was written in 2001, so almost 20 years ago. And the Agile Manifesto you can read as a huge open source document at that agilemanifesto.org address that's on your slide. What I want to highlight for you out of that whole manifesto, what does it mean? What is important to you in your nonprofit? It's about these values. These 4 stated values on the screen. We have the text in green on the left, and then we have the text in blue on the right. The bolded green text, those are things that we value in teams more than the things that are in blue on the right. It doesn't mean that the things in blue on the right aren't important. It means that we just prioritize those on the left more. So let's take a look at them. So individuals and interactions, we value that more than processes. Doesn't mean that it's not important, but we value our team members, our individual interactions, our team interactions. We value those more. Customer collaboration, or client or stakeholder, you can change that word out, over contract negotiation. We want to have conversations and understanding with our clients, our stakeholders, our collaborative partners, more than worry only about what that contract text says. Of course, we know that's important, especially, gosh, maybe we're in a grant situation with subcontractors. But that actual collaboration where the work is happening together, we value that more. And then that fourth value, if there is one that I think just screams, there's flashing, blinking lights. What is it that screams nonprofits? It's this last value, the fourth one, responding to change over following a plan. Yes, nonprofits live, love, have all sorts of strategic plans, spend lots of time developing and measuring against strategic plans. And that's important. But if there is one thing that we have learned in 2020, right, we need to respond to change. Plans are just that, best laid, best intended, but how do we react when something happens in our team or in the real world? That bold responding to change is where so many nonprofits they have shined this year. They responded to change. They talked to grant makers. They talked to their community. They adapted to the situation at hand. And as a result, have still maybe met or exceeded their fundraising goal. Maybe the way that they delivered their programs looks different, but they still delivered that service. They created that impact in their community. We saw great things happen in nonprofits that were able to respond to change this year. So that's a little bit about what is Agile. That's our umbrella. Now let's dive into that one framework under the umbrella, Scrum. The one that I mentioned has lots of case studies showing how well this works across different types of nonprofits. I want to give you a few pieces here as we build on our definition. What is Scrum? Good news, in nonprofit world, we don't need another acronym. This is not one. We don't need to buy another tool, have to have another system. It's not a software. Yes, there are software tools that help teams keep track of their backlog and the work they're doing, but you don't have to buy any software in order to be a Scrum team. And in case we have any sports fans on the line today, yes, while Scrum is the starting formation for rugby, that is not the context in which we're talking about Scrum today. So what Scrum is, now that we know what it is not, Scrum is a uniform approach to doing work. It's about how we iterate on whatever our work is, whether we're talking about hotline services for victims and survivors, or whether we're talking about outreach in the community, or whether we're talking about education. Doesn't matter what type of work it is, we're constantly iterating and improving on that work so that we best meet our mission in the nonprofit we're working in. And so that idea of having a consistent framework, a process by which our teams can improve our work, what we deliver to our community, to our target audience, and also improve ourselves as a team. That is what we're focused on in Scrum. Now, there's some other frameworks that are common in the nonprofit field that do also embrace Agile principles and those values that I showed you a few minutes ago. Show of hands, if you don't mind, in the chat box. Y for yes, N for no. Has anyone heard of or been part of a compression planning process? This is something that is used in some nonprofits when they come to strategic planning. This is something that some organizations have used when they think about a big new initiative or maybe a large scale collaboration. We've seen it pop up in some really big federal collaborations when they're getting started. It's a framework, a process by which you can take lots of stakeholders, consolidate it, and come up with what is the plan. So it's not the long-term framework. Scrum is constant across our work. It never changes. We use it day in, day out. But compression planning is one way in an agile mindset that we can go ahead and focus on one project design. So I see that there's not a lot of familiarity with compression planning. There's a lot of information available online about compression planning. Just wanted to highlight it because it is something that some nonprofit professionals have been familiar with, and it is agile in its nature as well. So here's actually a website that's got a great deal of information. So if you check out the McNeil website, you can click through it even when you get the handouts after today's session. That might be a great place to get started. And then if you want to learn more, of course, Google could always be our friend. So here's the line that usually gets people interested in Scrum. So Scrum was co-created by Dr. Jeff Sutherland and Ken Schwaber, literally 25 years ago. They just had their 25th anniversary last month. And since then, Dr. Sutherland has written a book, The Art of Doing Twice the Work in Half the Time. What does that line mean? Well, in our world, it means creating twice the impact in half the time. We don't want to talk about the work, we want to talk about the impact in the nonprofits. But this is what gets most people hooked. I know it's what got me interested years ago. When I first read it, I thought, wait, could I get more done without working more hours? I don't want to burn the candle at both ends. I want to see my family. I want to see my friends. What does this really mean? And so I was intrigued. I got the hook. I wanted to know more. The reality of this title, what it is that teams that use the Scrum framework are able to produce twice the value that they previously were in half the time. That is what the case studies show, that they are able to produce more value more quickly. It's not that they're working more hours. We're not asking nonprofit staff to do more hours in the office. That's not it at all. But that's really what this is about, producing more value in less time. And so when we look at the Scrum framework, I know that there is a lot on the slide for you right now. This is a huge deal of information that you're looking at right now. You'll want to just save this as reference. Please don't feel like you need to digest all of it right now. But the reality is, Scrum as a framework has very basic rules. And a great way to remember them is 3 roles, 5 events, 3 artifacts. So you might even hear a lot of us in the field talk about it as the 3-5-3. These are the rules that any Scrum team follows. And so as you learn a little bit more, if you're interested in learning about Scrum, these are the things that you'll start to see in your own team. The roles that people play within a team, the events that the team goes through on an ongoing basis throughout their year, and some artifacts, things that help make our work visible. So why do nonprofits use Scrum? Why do they think about learning the framework, understanding what the roles are? What are those visual artifacts that we use? Well, there's what we think success looks like, that straight arrow on the left. That's what a wonderful ideal if that actually worked. Oh, but there's real world things that happen, whether it's 2020 or any other year in our history. There's things that might get in our way. There's things that might make the winding path to success look a little bit different. We didn't expect that it would take longer to get that input from a collaborative partner. We didn't expect that the funder was going to change the requirements during the grant year. We didn't expect fill in the blank. There's always all sorts of things that change. So we might still get to our end goal, our big idea of what success is, of achieving our mission. But when we look back, we're like, oh, that was not a straight line. That was quite the winding path. So is there anything we can do, though, to maybe make the winding a little smaller, a little faster, so that we don't get derailed? We want to deliver value to our communities, to our target audiences. So that's one thing that drives us. What's another thing that drives a lot of nonprofits to think about Scrum? I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to read this book from Beth Cantor and Eliza Sherman. It's been out for a few years now, The Happy, Healthy Nonprofit. This is a fantastic book that gives tactical ideas and strategies for how nonprofit professionals and nonprofit leaders can try and reduce burnout in the field. This year, we've talked a fair amount in the field about compassion fatigue. There's so much happening, and nonprofit professionals are feeling a lot of fatigue from the compassion that they're providing through their communities. But burnout has been a conversation for years. And why? Because nonprofit professionals are so incredibly passionate about the work they do. And so they do all sorts of heroic things, extra hours, extra assignments, a new committee that they're going to be a part of or lead. And they are with the best of intentions that they take on those new things. But at some point, we might be facing burnout. Or maybe it's not burnout the way it's going to be defined at a high level. Maybe it's just dissatisfaction. Like, oh, I feel like maybe the grass will be greener on the other side in a nonprofit. Maybe I won't work as many hours. Maybe I'll be able to say no to those extra things. And so then there's turnover in the field. So these things exist. Do they have to be a part of our work, though? Are there solutions? Our answer at Agile and Nonprofits is yes, there are solutions. There are ways that we can work in our team environment that make us happier, that can still help us produce great value, maybe even faster. So I want you to think about the theory of constraints and how this is going to play out. We want to avoid burnout. We want to avoid turnover. And ultimately, we want to create more impact faster. So the theory of constraints. When we did my intro, Connie told you I'm up in the Thousand Islands. So I love anything that is a water-related analogy. So if we think about the flow of water, and if we had a constraint, some sort of dam, something that's going to stop that flow of water or constrict it, we might end up with some water that's kind of just hanging out, waiting to get through. It's not able to go all the way through and flow through. So instead of water, think about your work. Is there something that is stopping the flow of work or slowing it down? Is there a process, maybe a signature process, an approval process? Is there something that comes to mind for you that in your organization or your team is potentially slowing down or constraining your work? Don't worry, you don't have to type that into the chat box, but I want you to just think, is there a role? Is there a name? Is there a process? Is there something in your work that comes to mind that is a constraint? Something that if you could address it, might make your work faster. I'm guessing that pretty much everyone was able to come up with something. This is not anything negative about your organization or the organization of a colleague on the line. It's simply the fact that when we as humans come together as teams, we are really good at complicating things and putting in processes that seem important but might slow things down. So we want to think about if there's anything we can do to lessen the constraints, let the work flow faster, which will help us create impact in our communities faster. One of those things we're thinking about is the velocity of our team, the speed at which we do great things that deliver impact to our communities, to our target audience. So I wanted to show you this graph. So on the horizontal axis, we see team velocity. Velocity is measuring the value that we're delivering, the work that we're completing, whatever the work might be. On that vertical y-axis, we see team happiness. That's right, we're talking about team happiness. Not happiness with the organization, not happiness outside of the team. We can't control that, but happiness with their role and with the team itself. If we have a happy team, we see teams that produce impact faster. It's as simple as that. Happy teams, they drive speed. They produce impact faster. So now let's think back to that book, The Happy, Healthy Nonprofit. If we have happy, and they say healthy as well, I totally agree with Beth. She loves to talk about walking meetings and taking stretch breaks, having all sorts of standing desks. Good. Yes, happy and healthy. I'm with it. Let's do it. That'll make our teams faster. And here's another reason why, especially if you are in a role of management or supervision or leadership, why do you care about team happiness? Well, it would be great if everyone's happy in their team at work. That's good. Yep, it's a feel-good thing. And it's nice to know that it would make us faster. But as a metric, it also gives us an interesting indicator about, is our team's performance going to be stable? Might it increase, or might it start to go down? So team happiness is a leading indicator of performance. So what that means is, if we are watching our team's happiness on an ongoing basis, not just annually, not even just quarterly, but on an ongoing, consistent basis, we might be able to see those predictions about, is our team about to slow down? If their happiness starts to drop as a team, again, not because of what's happening in the world or bigger things in the organization, but as a team, if their happiness drops, we're going to see that the impact they're delivering to the community, the things they're finishing so they could be used or delivered, is about to slow down. And so, this one always stops me in my tracks, because as a business owner, as a leader of many Scrum teams, I want to pay attention to this, because I want my colleagues to be happy, but I want to make sure that we're really producing that impact and value in our communities. So let's transition that to Agile leadership. I was just talking about, well, what if you're in a management role or supervision or leadership? Why might you watch those metrics? Let's think about Agile leadership, though, in a slightly different way. I would like each of you to think about your own profile picture, maybe the one that's in Gmail or on LinkedIn, wherever it is. I'd like you to think about placing that right here on the slide. Because the reality is that Agile leaders, what does it mean to be an Agile leader? It's got nothing to do with title. It has nothing to do with the org chart. You don't need to have the mug from Michael Scott on The Office, that sitcom show where he walks around with the world's best boss mug. Nope, that's not it at all. Regardless of what role you sit in, you can be an Agile leader. So as we're talking about the Scrum framework, as we're thinking about why nonprofits might look at Agile as a mindset, why they might take the tactical Scrum framework, why might they do it? Because they are excited about how to make their teams faster, about how to make their teams better. Anyone can do that from any position in a team. Let me show you some of the things that Agile leaders do, so that maybe you can help self-identify a bit more with why you might have just placed your own headshot into that blank picture I showed you a minute ago. So we have here a diagram. It's from a book called the Agile Leadership Toolkit. And what it shows us are the 4 different domains of Agile leaders. Again, it's not about title or role, but when you think about what an Agile leader does in a team environment, they're inspiring, they're facilitating, they're helping to experiment, maybe take some risks or try new ideas. And they are being a cultural leader. They're helping to design healthy habits, maybe even exhibiting how, when your email says out of office as an autoresponder, that you honor that. Don't have to be the formal leader in order to show that type of leadership within your team. So those are the 4 different segments that we see in Agile leadership. And again, it doesn't have anything to do with your title or where you are on the org chart for you to be someone who can help facilitate in your team, or to inspire your team, or to set some standards for what your team culture would look like. So I want to bring one of my favorite experts to the field. So JJ Sutherland is the CEO of Scrum. That's right. Wait, Sutherland, we talked about Dr. Jeff Sutherland. Yes, this is his son. He's the current CEO of Scrum, but his heart, his background, also in nonprofits. JJ came to Scrum Inc. from a great career in NPR. And so JJ shared some thoughts with me recently about what was it like in nonprofits? Why might they want to use Scrum? And ultimately, where should they start? So rather than paraphrase or try to quote JJ, I thought, let's let you hear from him directly.
But what's your definition of an agile leader? If a nonprofit professional, regardless of what their org chart says, if they want to be an agile leader, what do you think that should mean to them?
Well, I think that there are multiple kinds of leadership. There's sort of like okay, I'm the one in charge. This is what we need to do, right? The CEO kind of, traditional CEO. And I'm saying command and control. They can be a great CEO, but often CEOs are really busy and they don't have the time, and they're out raising money. That's really what a CEO of a nonprofit's job is: raise money. I've worked with CEOs of nonprofits. Yeah. I know that that's their job. So, but there's also leadership through influence. And I think in nonprofits that it happens in every organization, but I think in nonprofits it's even more so. You want to build a coalition of the willing. And the way to do that, the way to begin, is find one thing. One thing that's got some visibility, and you can get a dedicated team to it, and then drive and demonstrate the performance, because nothing speaks louder than success. So if you have just one area that you can control, you want to make sure it's end to end, like one project or something that you can get people 100% dedicated to, or at least as much as you can, and then do it with them. And then everyone's going to start looking at your team going, I want to be like that. Mm. That's the way I want to be. Like demonstrating success, you'll increase your ability to lead through influence.
But what?
So hearing from JJ, right, he acknowledges that the big leader, the CEO, they're out there raising money. That's what nonprofits need, right? To secure the grants or the annual appeal support through the letter, you need to help raise the funds. But if we think about agile leadership, that is something that is open to any nonprofit professional in any team setting. And what JJ was encouraging was for you to think about something that you can make visible. So if you want to embrace that agile leadership idea, what's a project that you could try? Ideally, we want to help you think about using the Scrum framework because it's repeatable. It's a way that you can operationalize a process that's going to bring impact. So what JJ was talking about is how you as a leader, it's not about your title, it could be anyone in the team, if you can find these values within yourself and how you work within your team. Do you create a culture of openness? Do you create a culture of respect, of courage, focus on a project, commitment towards a goal or your mission? Those are the values of a Scrum team. Those are the values that we want to embody within any of your work, whether we're talking about a grant team, a program service team, the leadership, the senior leadership team. It doesn't matter what team we're talking about in a nonprofit. We want to encourage these 5 values so that we're focusing on the impact we're creating. So I wanted to help you understand just that, the impact that we might see in nonprofits that are using the Scrum framework. So I want to share with you a few case studies to help get you inspired, help get you thinking. And I want to open it up for some discussion, some Q&A in that chat box. Now, I know I'm about to use probably some more Scrum framework language. So all the way back to that slide where I showed the 3, 5, 3, those 3 roles, the 5 events, and the 3 visual artifacts. I know, right? We're just getting started in this topic on a Friday. There's not enough coffee to learn it that fast, not for anyone. So if you've got questions as we go, definitely keep them coming in the chat box. So this first case study is from a group called Cosmic. And Cosmic is a social enterprise, and they focus on working with nonprofits and a lot of municipalities as well that are focusing on branding, on outreach campaigns. So sometimes that's about website design, sometimes that's about actual outreach language that you're using. And so what their team does is they use sprints. Sprints are one of the 5 events that we looked at quickly in that framework. And so the sprint, they choose to use a 1-week sprint. This is basically the container of time that the team operates in. They do the same events then every week, and they iterate and they get feedback literally every week. And so what Cosmic does is when they work with a specific nonprofit, they engage them in that weekly cycle of feedback. Cosmic would present something for feedback to the nonprofit. The nonprofit they're working with would give feedback. And this happened every week. And it works at such a speed many of the nonprofits are like, oh, we're being asked for our input all the time. Wow, look at how fast we went from an idea, just really throwing some ideas on the wall, to something of value. They had something of value that they could give feedback on within the first week each and every time. Now you'll see that the little icon here that says sprint, it says 1 to 4 weeks. You can have a sprint cycle that is 1 week, 2 weeks, 3, or 4. Doesn't matter within those options. What's important is that they're consistent. So if you're running 2-week sprints where you are creating a goal and doing work, you're always running 2-week sprints. That is your cadence of work. So Cosmic, using these 1-week sprints, they were inspiring and giving structure to nonprofits. They were being exposed to this idea of how quickly they could provide something of value, something that it's a draft. It's not perfect at the beginning, right? They're showing an increment of their ultimate piece and getting feedback so that they don't get too far along in the process before all of a sudden a stakeholder says, whoa, 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 hold on. I think you totally misunderstood what we were thinking. The farthest they can get is 5 working days before they're like, oh, all right, so we're going to actually unwind that idea a little bit and keep going. I'm thinking, when we did my bio, we talked about how a lot of my experience and background was in grants, grant making, grant seeking. And if I stop to think about early on in my career, maybe some of the mistakes I made, I would spend forever getting something ready so that I could share it with a board member or a leader in the organization so that I could get their feedback. And I would want it to be nearly perfect before I shared it. And then I'd get feedback and have to spend all sorts of times in some situations if there had been an assumption, an error in my understanding. Oh my goodness, I'd almost have to undo it. But I'd wanted it to be so polished and perfect first. Whatever the work was that I was presenting, I had a hard time giving it for feedback until it had met a pretty polished standard. Sprints are the opposite of that. It's not about the polish. It has to work. It has to be able to be understood, but it's about an iterative process for feedback, driving toward that final great idea, that final finished piece, so that we don't have any waste. Because if we think back to that theory of constraints, it showed waste, water that was waiting to get through. Well, if we're spending too much time making things perfect before we get feedback from our colleagues or our collaborative partners, that is waste that might not ever be utilized for the benefit of our organization. So what happened then was that these nonprofits that would work with Cosmic, they would take it and run with it after the project was done. And a great example was the Santa Cruz Economic Development Corporation was like, this sprint thing was amazing because they loved that they got to see something and give feedback so quickly throughout the project. And so they found ways then to think about their own work on that weekly cadence. What is it that we're doing? What are our projects, our initiatives that we could deliver something? Maybe to internal stakeholders, maybe to external, but what could we provide where we could get feedback on an ongoing basis? So what they're really doing, Sprint, that's one of the 5 events. That event where we're getting feedback, that's one of the other events. It's one of ours. We'll call it a second one. We'll look at the sprint review, the idea that what you're doing each sprint, you're getting feedback on so you can improve and iterate. Scrum is all about continuous improvement. So let's look at a second example. Let's move to the arts space for a minute. So instead of visual outreach and outreach campaigns, let's think about the way in which different sectors interact, how grant makers and grant seekers sometimes request things of each other, or the dependencies that might be there. So maybe some of you in other work have heard of data arts. So data arts, now known, it's morphed, it's been merged, and it's now SMU Data Arts. But so the story begins back when Beth Tuttle was still president and CEO. And Data Arts had come out of the Pew Charitable Trust, and they had the Cultural Data Project, which they were about to launch. What they were doing was they were revising, they were enhancing what had been known as the Cultural Data Profile. It was a way that arts organizations had to enter all sorts of information so that their potential arts-focused grant makers could review it. And so a lot of it, I'll be frank, I'd had to fill it out years and years ago. It felt like what you might put into GuideStar. We're like, well, you could read my 990 and figure this out. But so there was what felt like a fair amount of duplication of effort. And quite frankly, the audience that the original data profile was considering was what were the needs of the grant makers. Now, like I said, I've been on both sides, so I get it. There's some interesting dynamics and relationships, and so grantees do a lot at the request of grant makers because they need the funding. But so as this transition was happening, they shifted and decided that the transformation should really be about how can we make this tool, which grant makers will still use, how can they use it in a way that will also be good for the grant seekers? So they thought about their new audience. They really focused on the grant seeker, the nonprofit organization. So the mission of Data Arts is to empower leaders with high quality data and evidence-based resources to overcome challenges and increase impact. And we love this because data helps us be empirical. It helps us use data to make decisions. And so if we're using our data to make decisions, that might help us get to impact in a more factual way. We love it. There was something about the way that they went through this process, another one of our 5 events that I wanted to highlight. So they used a daily huddle, or what they called at that time, a daily stand-up. We now refer to it in the field as a daily scrum because it's more accessible language. Not everyone is able to stand for the 15-minute meeting. And so we want everyone to instead think about participating in the daily scrum. Standing, optional, but the idea is that we huddle. We come together for 15 minutes every day to talk about our progress towards our sprint goal. Let's say, for example, we're in that 1-week sprint like we were with Cosmic. Everyone that's on that team comes together and just does a quick check-in, not a status report, but how are we doing towards progress on our goal? And most importantly, are there any impediments? Are there any constraints? Are there any things that are holding us back that we need to resolve as a team? And so these daily stand-ups, in the place of the Data Arts organization, they completely wiped out these standing 1 to 2 hour planning and status meetings that were all over their calendar. Instead, they had these 15-minute daily stand-ups as a way to understand how things were progressing and to quickly, as you know, within 24 hours of something happening, talk about an impediment and try to remove it. This is an incredibly powerful event out of the 5 in Scrum where many nonprofits will choose to start. The rest of the framework will come later. They'll get to it, but they choose to start with the daily Scrum, getting their teams together. Not all the teams, it's just the team. One team, 3 to 9 people, focused on one goal. So maybe it's the grant team, maybe it's the program team, maybe it's the fill in the blank, but one team gets together and for 15 minutes or less has a conversation about progress towards that sprint goal. What are we going to accomplish this week? Or what are we accomplishing in these 2 weeks? And most importantly, what are the impediments that we might need to remove? It can be little things. I think we've got a little tech glitch here because I'm getting bounce backs on this registration page when we tested it. And I don't know how to fix that part of the website. Do we need to call our tech vendor, or is that something someone in the team knows how to do? Geez, we were working on this application and you know what? We're stuck until we get this data number out of our database or out of our collaborative partners database. If there's something that has stopped the work or slowed it down, the team needs to talk about it. How fast can we fix it? And so this daily stand-up within Data Arts, they loved it. As I said, I mean, managed. Yes, it was a daily thing for 15 minutes that was now on their calendar, but they erased hours worth of planning and status meetings. So not only were they ahead in terms of how their calendar looked, all of a sudden they were quickly removing impediments and solving issues together. One more case study to give you a different idea of what it looks like. And this is one that starts as a grassroots organization. Because sometimes we'll get questions like, well, I'm a small organization. Would this work for me? Or folks will say, I'm a large organization. Will this work for me? The answer is yes. The framework works in all nonprofits across all different sizes, types, missions. So this organization that I wanted to share with you for inspiration is the New Bohemian Innovation Collaborative, known as NewBoCo for short. And so NewBoCo is in Iowa, and it's a nonprofit that was founded by a gentleman who did have extensive for-profit experience in Scrum and Agile. And so as Eric Engelman, who actually is currently the board chair for Scrum Alliance, a nonprofit in the Scrum sector, when Eric founded NewBoCo, it was only, air quotes, a 2-person team. And they used the Scrum framework. They only had 2 people. So hold on, wait a second. That's interesting. There were 3 roles. They were quickly growing though, so they quickly had 3 people, so all the roles were filled. But they had their roles, they had the 5 events, they had their 3 artifacts, and within just literally a few years, they grew to 19 team members. They had increased their budget from what started as a small grassroots. They'd increased their budget by 10-fold. What was interesting about NewBoCo, well, there's countless things about the story with them that are fascinating, but they really focused on everything being visible. All work was visible. And so what would that mean for you? So visible might mean what it did to them. This is all pre-COVID, and so they were all always in the office together, and they had these big boards that they made. Literally, these are like clothing racks you'd use in a store, and they screwed wipeable, like the white thing that you'd put, like the white, it's not real whiteboard, it's like what you would put in a bathroom or a kitchen, maybe in an industrial setting. They got it at Home Depot, and they screwed them to the boards. And this meant that they could roll these boards where they were keeping track of their progress on projects, of their sprints. They could roll them all over the office. Well, they grew a lot, remember? So it started with 1 board, and as they grew, they would use wall space. They would use anything for where they were sharing information. So they were all about making work visible, not just the work itself, but also their continuous improvement for the team, which brings me to highlighting another Scrum event, what's called the retrospective. The sprint review I mentioned briefly is about giving feedback on work, what we actually produce. Retrospectives are about inspecting and adapting the team, really drilling down on that team happiness idea and how we can be better as a team. So NewBoCo didn't only make their work visible, the things they were doing, they made those vulnerable pieces, the like what went well, what didn't go as well as we had hoped, what could we improve. They even had that visible for everyone in the organization, any visitor, any board member. Everyone could see that when they came into their office. So now, from 1 board to this huge space where they offer their trainings, where they do their work, that is what it became. Still completely visible, where anyone can walk through and understand where teams are in their process to see what was their one hypothesis that they were going to focus on as a team to make them better and happier this next sprint. Those were the sort of things that they were focusing on for the visibility of their work. Their organizational culture, that agile mindset, indeed, it was from the very top, right, with founder Eric Engelman all the way through. Now you might say, does that mean that they only hired people that already knew what Scrum was? Did they only have board members that understood Scrum? Absolutely not. No. So Eric and his co-founder, They knew what Scrum was, and they would bring their professionals in that had the expertise they wanted for the team, for the work they were doing. Occasionally, someone might know what Scrum or Agile was, but they helped them to understand the framework. They wanted them for their contribution to the mission. That's why they were there. Same thing with board members. Board members didn't understand necessarily all the roles and the events that the teams were doing. What they knew was how visible the work was to them, how transparent everything was, that they could walk in and see what was happening. They didn't have to wait for a dashboard at a board meeting. Sure, they'd get it, but they could see it at any time. So NewBoCo is really about the visibility. Now, I know how much we've covered in such a short period of time, and it's meant to be something to get you thinking, something to help get you started in thinking about Agile and about the Scrum framework. And I can see we already have a question from Remla. Can you please repeat what a sprint is versus a retrospective? That's great. Let's start there. So a sprint, that is the container of time, the container that our work is done in. So it counts as an event in Scrum. It is between 1 to 4 weeks. And whatever it is you decide, whether it's 1, whether it's 4, it is consistent for your team. So it is the consistent cadence in which we do work. You might say, well, how do I decide which one? Think about how quickly you can produce something of value that you could get feedback on from a colleague or from a stakeholder. That's the best way to think about what is the right length for a sprint. Now, a retrospective is something that happens every sprint. So if you have a 2-week sprint, you'll have a retrospective every 2 weeks. If you have a 1-week sprint, you'll have a retrospective every week. The retrospective is the event in Scrum where we inspect and adapt our team. We think about improving our work as a team. I'll also throw in here, add a little bit to your question too. The sprint review would happen 1 time per sprint. So if it's a 1-week sprint, once a sprint. If it's a 3-week sprint, once every 3 weeks. A sprint review is where we inspect and adapt our work. So the retrospective is team. The sprint review is the work itself. Because again, the framework is all about continuous improvement. And that means continuous improvement of our work that we deliver as our nonprofit for our community and then for our team as well. Such a great question. Thanks for getting the ball rolling with questions. You can also email me questions afterwards because I get how much this is to digest. But go ahead, if you've got other questions, let's throw them into that chat box, or go ahead, if you've got one, you could put it in the Q&A box, either one. Happy to take them in either situation. I'd also, while you're typing questions, I know they take a minute, we've got a lot of information available on social media. Whether you like Twitter, YouTube, free downloads with templates, wherever you want to be, we've got all sorts of information for you. So please feel free to connect after today. I do want to give a little shout out here because Jennifer has already arranged for you a follow-up session for today where we're going to dig in deeper. We're going to talk about what does this look like in one type of team in particular, and we're going to focus on grants to help give you even more inspiration. We know how many of your organizations rely on grants for some of your revenue, so we thought let's show you how you can use it in that particular type of team and then maybe build from there. So that's coming up next week, and I know a number of you are already registered. But hopefully that'll give you some more tactical information as we think about it. So that'll be on December 8th at 11 where we'll be doing that. And I also want to make sure that you know if you go to Agile and Nonprofits, you're going to find free downloads and templates, free webinars, like there's all sorts of additional learning that you can do after today or after next week's webinar. And so because of how much we respect and honor and love working with the Niskative team, we wanted to make sure you had a discount code. Please don't feel any pressure, but if you want to learn more, about any of the other trainings, we want to make sure that you could at least get a discount special for you today. So we've got a code for that as well. But let's see if there's any other questions, or Connie, Jennifer, if you have any too, because I know how much you've been learning the last few months. So maybe any of your initial beginning questions, if you think they'd be valuable to your colleagues, I'm happy to take those as well.
Hey, Diane, I wonder, for some of the participants today, they might be thinking about like the direct service work that happens with survivors of domestic violence. And, you know, it could be within a shelter environment, or it could be more broadly non-residential community-based environments. But it feels like maybe for some people, it's the ongoing work of the organization. I wonder if you could maybe say a little bit more about the framework of how it might be helpful for folks to think about kind of matching things, you know, the work of the organization and the dailiness of the work with the framework that you just talked about.
Sure. And so there's, you know, all teams and the type of work they do look very different. And some you don't have a lot of, we'll say, interruptions or unplanned things that might come up. But when you're in direct service, you might have a phone call that comes in via your helpline that you don't know when the phone's going to ring, and you don't know what sort of work it's going to take. You just know that you will always answer the phone and provide whatever it takes. So that is hard to plan for. And so when we look at the framework and what's being planned, we like to talk about your product backlog. I get it. Service, not product, but it's called your product backlog in the framework. And that's what your planned work is. So when you're thinking about what sort of work might our team get done in this sprint, what the framework will help you do on a consistent basis is say, okay, we know that as a team, probably 50% of our time is going to be handling, answering phone calls, connecting people to services, following up with folks. Maybe that's going to be half of our time. But then let's see, we've got some planned work. We've been wanting to update this particular brochure, or we've been wanting to release a new video that could go on our website. You might have some big ideas that help your service overall, but aren't the direct work with the clients. And so you can think about, well, how much capacity do we have for that work, that planned work, compared to always answering the phone and always connecting to services, that critical mission work that we're doing. And that way you can plan, how are we going to iterate and improve those ancillary support pieces that ultimately improve our work and our delivery of the mission. But so it gives you a planning mechanism, because quite frankly, I like to do all the things. I don't know about you, but I love to do all the things all the time. Have a great idea, let's do it now. That's going to create burnout. And so within our focus on delivering this mission critical direct service, how can we address those other big ideas that need to get done? How can we prioritize them? And how can we figure out when will we be able to do it as a team? The answer is not all right now. Not healthy, not a good idea. And that, I think, is one of the big things that even if you're very hands-on with your clients, with your community, there is a great space to use the framework to help get those other things done and understand when and how. Great question, Con. Thank you for asking that. Awesome. Well, I know that we're coming to the top of the hour, and I'm guessing that everyone probably has another meeting or important to do item that they've got to focus on. So I want to conclude by saying thank you for being with us. I look forward to seeing many of you again when we do the follow-up, where we dig a little deeper and talk about this in the grant setting is another way to give you some examples. I hope you understand how willing I am to answer any questions, wherever it is you're comfortable. LinkedIn Messenger, Facebook Messenger, email, wherever you want to ask questions, I'm happy to answer. And so please reach out if you have any questions before Tuesday's session or when you watch this recording later. But we're really excited that you wanted to learn a little bit about the Agile mindset and that tactical Scrum framework. So I wish everyone a great afternoon, and I hope to see you Tuesday. Connie, Jennifer, thanks for having us.
Thanks again, Diane. And again, a big thanks to everyone for joining us today. And we hope to see you on Tuesday as well.